Once again this year, Boston will honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by reading one of his speeches. This year's reading, to be held on April 16th at City Hall Plaza, will be a speech that was circulated in the form of a letter from jail in Birmingham, Alabama. It has since become a political and spiritual guidepost, coupling the mission of nonviolence with the tactic of civil disobedience. To tell us about the reading is the outreach minister from Berachah Church in Dorchester, Reverend Vernon K. Walker. Thank you very much for being with us, Reverend.
Thank you, Chris.
Talk about your own familiarity with this letter. I mean, when you growing up, how did you learn about this letter?
I first became familiar with the Birmingham letter when I was an undergrad at Penn State University. I had an opportunity to delve into this letter and to really dig deep to the dimensions, the spiritual, the economical, and the political dimensions that the letter contains through a class that I had on the life and thought and the philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that was the first opportunity that I actually had to really peruse through the letter.
What about the circumstances? This goes back to 1963, during the period of the Civil Rights Movement, following the Great Migration, the whole history in the southern part of the United States. What was going on in Birmingham, Alabama that brought MLK there?
Well, there was injustice happening. There was racial injustice with Bull Connor and in Alabama. It was the height of racial injustice. There were black citizens being told that they were less than, essentially. And there was still a segregation policy existing within the parameters of the city, in spite of the 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that made segregation unconstitutional. So Dr. King was invited by Fred Shuttlesworth and the Alabama Human Rights Movement that were working on the ground to try to achieve true equality, but the situation got so tense and it got so out of control that Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth called Dr. King and reached out to Dr. King and said that we need you and your organization's help to dramatize these conditions.
No, conditions, it is not just one thing probably, because it could be education, it could be voting rights. I mean, there must have been just a whole number of things stuck together for people, right?
That's right. And there was an amalgamation of issues. Blacks were not being able to vote and place their vote because without a vote, then one does not have a voice in this political system. And essentially there was disenfranchisement going on. And as Dr. King said in the letter, he was there because not only was he invited, but injustice, it was existing there. And essentially it's that famous quote that people repeat in different ways and in different venues and different settings. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that Dr. King has said in the letter, to whom he was writing to men of goodwill.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Reverend Vernon K. Walker from Berachah Church in Dorchester. Reverend, what was also interesting here, what prompted the letter was deciding how far to go with protest. Bull Connor, the sheriff, he was going to be very hardline about trying to come down against this. Mm-hmm. And King was saying, no, we're not going to back down, we're going to march. And there are some allies of King who said, well, wait a minute, we don't want to get into some sort of a provocation here. And what was King's response to that?
Well, King's response was this long, beautiful, eloquent letter that we know as the Birmingham letter. Oftentimes, people who are sitting in prison cells have a whole lot of time on their hands. So King, in fact, addresses at the end of the letter that this letter would not have been as long as if he had had the opportunity to write it from outside the prison cell. So essentially, King was in prison because he was standing in solidarity with black and brown brothers and sisters who were being treated unfairly and unjust, and who were suffering under the hands of Bull Connor and the racist police, who oftentimes would not treat citizens of color as human beings, but treat them as property, treat them inhuman. In fact, it's interesting that it was the same Selma, Alabama, where water hoses were turned on children and water hoses were turned on nonviolent protesters who simply were asking and demanding justice under law. And King essentially tells the white clergy and people of goodwill and white folks of goodwill that an unjust law is no law at all, because they, in their letter and in the newspapers, claim that King and the Southern Christian leadership group is outsiders, agitators. But King retorts so beautifully and eloquently in the letter that anyone living in the United States cannot be considered an outsider. And essentially, I am as concerned about the conditions in Selma, Alabama, as I am concerned about the conditions in Atlanta, Georgia.
Well, you know, we heard that term outsiders. It's still used today for certain people. What about the sense of history in your family? Your family comes from the South, maybe not Alabama, but what were their stories of this period? What were they like?
So I have a grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who hails from Estelle, South Carolina, deep, deep South, the backwoods, and she oftentimes told the story of how horrible it was to go to stores or to drive by when she was a little girl. And as a teenager, drive by signs on stores that said for white people only, and it didn't give her a sense of pride, but it gave her a sense of shame because she thought she wasn't good enough. She thought she wasn't fearfully and wonderfully made, as the scriptures tell us. So we see that these rules and regulations of the time and laws of the time were inconsistent with loving one another, as the gospel has commanded to love your neighbor, to love one another as thyself. So essentially, she told the story of how treacherous and how horrible and mind-blowing the experience was for her as a little girl and as a teenager growing up in the South.
What about what happened when Martin Luther King was being held in jail? A lot of people might see that as a legal obstacle. He saw it also as a leverage, I think, to exert his leadership. Don't you think so?
Absolutely, because he was willing to put his body on the line. Oftentimes in society today, we have a lot of leaders who are talking about injustice and a lot of leaders who are saying injustice exists, but the question should become, are they willing to put themselves on the line? And King stands in a beautiful prophetic tradition of the Old Testament prophets who were willing to put their bodies on the line. King stands in the prophetic tradition of Jesus, who essentially put his body on the line.
Oh, Daniel in the lion's den, right?
Yes, Daniel in the lion's den. As King actually mentions, he mentions in this beautiful letter how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar because they had the courage of their conviction. And essentially, King is a beautiful example in a paradigm of when a leader has the courage of his or her convictions to put themselves on the line.
We should mention, speaking of leaders, we have some in Boston, and they're going to be taking part in this reading on April 16th, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. On April 16th, starting at 4 o'clock, there's going to be this reading. There's going to be a reading taking place in the entire letter of the Birmingham letter, and we have over 100 readers who are coming from various spaces and places of life. We have community activists, we have clergies, we have rabbis, we have union and labor leaders coming together to stand in unison to read various parts of this Birmingham letter and to really to demonstrate united we are, divided. The united we are, divided we fall. And this event is put on as a collaboration between the New Democracy Coalition and the Boston Mountaintop. And this is the second year that a King reading is taking place. Last year was the reading of King's last speech, the Mountaintop.
And we should mention the time again on April 16th?
The time is at 4 p.m. In front of Boston City Hall Plaza. We're going to have speakers out there. We're going to have music. We're going to have performers. It's going to be a grandiose time as we reflect on the 55th anniversary of Dr. King's Birmingham letter, and really what that means in the 21st century for Bostonians. What does that mean for us as American citizens? What does that mean for us who operate within social justice and within the confines of social justice in the 21st century in 2019?
Thank you very much for being with us. Reverend Vernon K. Walker from Berachah Church in Dorchester.